Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's program, Russia gives a lukewarm response to the Trump administration's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. Moscow says a pause in the fighting would simply give respite to Kyiv's forces. Moscow's forces continue to retake areas of the Russian region of Kursk. Well, last August, Ukraine seized parts of that region, marking the first foreign occupation of Russian territory since the Second World War. Speaking alongside the visiting Irish Prime Minister Micheál Martin, the US President Donald Trump says that residents of the Gaza Strip will not be expelled from the Gaza enclave. And that visit came ahead of the annual St. Patrick's Day celebrations across the globe. We're going to be asking in just a moment, how did Prime Minister Martin get on in those talks with President Trump at the Oval Office? Hello and welcome to the program. The US President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Moscow. Well, he's been there to lead the discussions on a ceasefire proposal for Ukraine. But in comments to the Russian media, the Kremlin outlined Russia's position on the 30-day truce, rejecting it, saying it would amount to nothing more than a temporary respite period for the Ukrainian military. They also said it would give Ukraine the chance to regroup. Well, the Kremlin aide added Russia seeks a long-term peace settlement in Ukraine, not a short one. Well, yesterday, President Trump suggested that he could target Russia financially. This as Ukraine's president urged him to take strong steps if Moscow fails to support the 30-day ceasefire. Well, President Trump's threat came as the French Defense Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, told a press conference in Paris that should a ceasefire announcement come, Europe would have to be prepared to enforce it.
Things you could do that wouldn't be pleasant in a financial sense. I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. I want to see peace, and we'll see. But in a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Scottie Nell Hughes, a Republican strategist and political commentator who joins us from Nashville, Tennessee. Scottie, great to see you once again here on Al Arabiya. Just reading between the lines and listening to what's being said in Moscow, it's beginning to sound like that US delegation in Moscow is going to return to Washington empty-handed. Is that how it looks to you?
I would be a little bit more cautious right now at this point. I think, just even as of a week ago, Vladimir Putin expressed his intent that he wanted peace and he wanted to settle the situation. But he is coming to the table with two hard lines. And the number one line being that Ukraine has to promise and NATO has to promise not to allow Ukraine into its family. And that is probably one of those hard lines that must be met. And we did not see that being a part of the agreement that we found out from Marco Rubio and Zelensky's talks. So I think if the U.S., obviously comes to the table without that at this stage, that it is a non-starter. But I do believe in President Trump having confidence in Witkoff and sending him rather than Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, to handle negotiations with Vladimir Putin and his administration. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. And until we actually see details coming out from the Kremlin going either way, I would just be more cautious and actually more hopeful, because it's in the benefit of all that they do come to some sort of peace agreement today before they leave Moscow.
Yeah, because a lot of the analysts we've spoken to have said that a 30-day ceasefire like this is a really important prelude. And there are lots of precedents where you've had these 30-day ceasefires that are then, been extended and turned into more long-lasting peace deals. But supposing they do go back to Washington with no deal, I mean, what's the next move by the Trump administration?
Well, let's just talk about the last 2 weeks. It's been absolutely disastrous for Ukraine and President Zelensky. I mean, he had a disastrous meeting at the White House. He went to the EU. The EU said, we'll do anything you need us to do, even if America backs out. That was not good enough for Zelensky. So he went back with his hat in hand to Marco Rubio and apologized to President Trump. And this is where we got to this point with Marco Rubio's deal, that you have to look from Russia's perspective. Like I said, they've got a hard line that it was not met a part of this deal. You also have this idea that the Russians continue to advance in key areas like Kursk, continue to win on the ground. So what is in it for them without achieving their goals on their own? And that's what I think, that's why I think Witkoff is a good business negotiator. And I think that this is why ultimately we will have peace in the solution. I think there's going to be a conversation that's going to happen between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And I think that's when we will actually have a determination as to peace in this area.
Yeah, I mean, we've received that report as well. It does sound, doesn't it, like Presidents Trump and Putin might be set to have a telephone conversation as soon as tonight. I mean, it does look as well, as you've been saying, like, Moscow's got the momentum on the battlefield right now and wants to keep fighting. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to persuade the Russians, I'm thinking here about Witkoff and the rest of the delegation, to come around to this idea of having a 30-day breather, essentially.
Well, this is why it's important, because the United States, I do not like the fact that the United States is involved in this in the first place. I do believe this has been a proxy fight from the West all along. But the fact that you're having to have Russia negotiate with the United States instead of directly with Ukraine just shows how much involvement the West has had in this entire conflict for the last 3 or 4 years. I think that you've got to see that the United States and Russia is also going to have to make some deals. There are a large amount of sanctions that the Biden administration put on Russia. I think that is a huge card that the United States can play, especially when they're continuing this trade war that's happening with these other countries and the tariff wars the tariffs that are being placed on key items like steel and aluminum, as well as the mineral rights. All of those things Russia can help supplement in the United States economy if this tariff war continues with Canada and as well as the EU, as Trump is continuing to say he's going to do. So there's a lot of benefits right now for the United States and Russia to be debating. But I think it's very telling in the fact that Russia and U.S. are having these conversations and not Russia and Ukraine directly.
We are hearing from the Russian Foreign Ministry that there are these more active contacts between the United States and Russia, which is what you've been saying as well. I mean, where do you see this heading to? I mean, obviously, the Ukraine ceasefire talks are one part of it, but there is a broader strategy from the Trump administration to re-engage with Moscow. Where's this heading?
Hopefully this is heading to global peace for all countries that are involved. It's in the best interest of everyone. During the last 3 years under the Biden administration, all that the United States involvement did was push Russia towards other countries like Iran and China. And that might not be in the best interest for Americans. It also considered millions and billions of dollars of American taxpayer dollars being poured into Ukraine, being unaccountable for. So I think, it's in the best interest for the world, for peace, but most importantly, coming from a citizen of the United States, in our best interest, that we do what we need to take right now to broker peace in the area. Vladimir Zelensky knows what that takes. And we will see, they say that the ball, Marco Rubio said the ball's in Russia's court. It really isn't. Vladimir Zelensky knows exactly what he needs to do if he wants to have peace in his region, the region that continues to be dominated as Russia continues to advance within the country. I think that it's up to Vladimir Zelensky. Does he really want to end this war, or is he going to continue to take millions of dollars, not only from America, but from the EU and all of the other countries in aid? And is that his ultimate goal, rather than actually having peace for his people?
Sorry, just to clarify what you're saying there, are you saying that Zelensky should simply surrender?
Absolutely not. But I'm saying Vladimir Zelensky needs to make sure that he legitimately wants peace. Those deals, just the little things that we knew that came out.
But he does. He does want peace. Media. He does want peace. He wants this 30-day ceasefire. Well, he wants this 30-day ceasefire.
Then agreed to the one stipulation that started this war, that Ukraine will not continue to push to join NATO. That's ultimately the red line, the hard line. And Zelensky has not said that he would agree to that yet. There's also the push that real free elections would happen in Ukraine. That he hasn't actually said that he's going to do that either.
Well, no, he can't, because there's martial law in place at the moment. So if there's a war going on, how can they?
He put in place, because he put martial law in place. So if
but all countries do that. All countries do that when there's a war.
So then say,
perfectly normal.
This conflict, and I will hold an election. But he hasn't even said that intent is going to happen. But ultimately, like I said, it comes down to the NATO. So while they say the ball's in Russia's court, it's really not. It's in Zelensky's court. If he would actually come to the table with the same things, the same reasons why this got started in the first place, I think you would see peace happen very quickly between the two countries.
So you're saying the solution is for actually not the United States to be involved, but for President Zelensky and President Putin to thrash it out between them?
Ideally, but I don't know if we can. And that's the thing. Zelensky has said that he's not going to talk directly to Russia without the United States being involved. Let's also back this up and talk about how just 2 weeks ago, there's this disastrous meeting in the Oval Office where Zelensky insulted our vice president, our Secretary of State, and President Donald Trump himself. And immediately the EU and Great Britain stepped up and said, you know what, you don't need the US. We'll back you up. And that wasn't good enough for Zelensky. And he went back to the US and apologized, saying, you know, I don't necessarily put all my faith and trust in the EU and the UK to back me up in this war. I need the United States involved. I think that's actually very insulting to the people in the EU and the UK, that Zelensky wouldn't take their support immediately. He thinks that he has to have the United States involved, which just shows how much involvement the U.S. has really been in this conflict from day one.
I mean, the U.S. has given, 40-something% of the military aid and assistance that Ukraine has received, and that's been very gratefully received. They've said thank you lots of times, again, in the last couple of days. The rest of it did come from Europe.
In the last couple of days.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, we've heard. I'm sure you'll remember President Zelensky going to Washington, addressing Congress, and thanking everyone profusely on at least one occasion, possibly more than one. But the rest of the aid came from Europe. So, obviously, it's taken Europe and the United States together, the combined weight of that aid, to support Ukraine. And it would be foolish of Ukraine to turn around and say, well, I don't want one or the other. I mean, clearly he needs both, doesn't he?
Well, that was the thing. The EU and the UK came back when Donald Trump stopped the sharing of aid and intelligence. The EU and the UK stepped up and they said, you don't need the US. We will support you enough to continue this conflict. It was Zelensky that made the decision that that was not enough, or that was not good enough for him, that he had to have the support of the United States in there, both military intelligence as well as financial aid. So I think that speaks volumes right there, is how much Zelensky's, depending on the U.S. for this war. And frankly, the American taxpayers elected Donald Trump to stop funding this war and to keep the money here at home. So Trump, if he really does want to fulfill his campaign promise that he made to the American people, which got him elected in November, he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that Russia and Ukraine come to the table and there's a peace settlement that's the result as soon as possible.
All the Ukrainian MPs and politicians we speak to, first of all, we ask them, even if they're opposition MPs, should elections be held right now? And they say, no, they shouldn't. There's a war. So let's move on from that one. But they also, are firmly behind Volodymyr Zelensky. And they keep saying to us, we didn't start this war. We didn't invade ourselves. Russia invaded Ukraine, and we've simply defended ourselves. I mean, what's wrong with what they've done in your view?
Of course they don't want election. I think that's because they know they're that unpopular, and their policies.
No, this is coming from opposition politicians.
In the first place is why they know they'll be voted out of office. Of course they don't want an election. Any politician knows that. They want to keep the great.
These are people who aren't in office. These are opposition politicians who aren't in office, and they're saying, obviously we support the president. We stand behind him. Now isn't the time for domestic political squabbles and election campaigns. There's a war. Our country is under attack. How can we hold an election? Let's fight this war. We support Zelensky. Everyone's telling us that, and we haven't heard any voices to the contrary.
Well, because he got rid of all the political parties that were his opposition over the last 3 years of the conflict. That's what Zelensky has done. Anybody that opposed him, the political parties that opposed him, he didn't allow them to exist anymore. He literally strangled them out and did not hold elections. I agree that, obviously, if you allowed free and fair elections, fine, then make it a part of the 30-day ceasefire deal and let the people decide within the 30 days. But Zelensky said, no, I won't even do it during those 30-day period. So ultimately, if Zelensky really wants peace, he will come back and this idea that, yes, the conflict, that they didn't start it. Well, they did everything they could to provoke it and to not stop it. And the number one line that started was their continued ambition to join NATO. And they made that obviously very clear, which obviously, actions have consequences. And that action caused the consequence for Russia to decide that they had to defend their border and their people that lived in those regions that Ukraine refused to acknowledge as being independent.
Yeah, but I mean, when you look at a map and you look at where Ukraine is, I mean, it's in a really vulnerable position, sort of between two tectonic plates, really, on the map. And, it's hardly surprising there should be a tussle, between, the East and the West over territory that was once part of the Soviet Union and has decided not to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. I mean, I don't think it's fair to blame Ukraine for being where it is.
Well, it used to be the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. That's why Ukraine exists where it is. And you have to understand the reason why Russia has not come in and completely focused and destroyed the country over the last three years militarily is the majority of Ukrainians have strong ties to Russians and vice versa. My grandparents were from Ukraine, but have strong ties and cousins in Russia. It's the areas are so intertwined. That's the reason why Vladimir Putin has not come in and completely destroyed the area, because it would cause severe backlash within his own country just due to the fact of how close knit those two countries are. But the regions that we're talking about, the regions of Donetsk and those three countries that the areas that actually had asked and voted for their own independence that Ukraine refused to acknowledge. They wanted to be separated from Ukraine. They didn't want to be a part of Russia either. Were being cleansed for those few years. And finally, Russia had had enough seeing their own people targeted and cleansed out from the area by the Ukrainian troops and soldiers at the orders of Vladimir Zelensky. So there was lots of different things that led to this conflict happening, and those we can debate. But more importantly, today's issue is what is it going to take to bring lasting peace to the region, and what can the United States do and Witkoff do in order to debate with both leaders to make them feel comfortable with a peace agreement happening as soon as possible.
So just to wrap up, do you think that, repairing relations between Moscow and Washington will automatically produce, perhaps, or serve as a catalyst to a conclusion to this 3-year-long war?
I absolutely think not only will it be a conclusion to this war, but also to several other conflicts around the world. The old adage goes, it's a small world. And we have shown this with this conflict. When we're dealing with issues in the Middle East, dealing with issues over with China, I think it is in the best interest that everybody at least has the same goals in mind and want to work together, not only for the best interest of their own country, but for the global economy and the global peace.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A great pleasure speaking to Scottie Nell Hughes. Always great having you with us. Thanks again. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President Obama. He joined us from Washington. Great to have you with us again, Joel, here on Al Arabiya News. Does it look to you like this US delegation is going to be coming back to Washington pretty much empty-handed?
Well, it's wonderful to be with you and with your viewers. And the test that President Trump put forward to Vladimir Putin, it looks like we're getting some results. And Vladimir Putin might very well be failing this test. What's happening now is a very interesting twist in the dynamics of the diplomacy on Ukraine and Russia, where President Trump clearly was pressuring Ukraine for a number of weeks, months, one could argue years, but in the recent weeks in particular. And President Zelensky of Ukraine called his bluff and said, I will agree to a ceasefire. And now, of course, the message from President Trump being carried by his envoy, Steve Witkoff, is that Vladimir Putin needs to agree to that as well. And by being rejected, which is what it appears, that is going to put a very difficult set of discussions going forward into the White House about how do they respond? Do they call out Vladimir Putin? That's something they haven't done before. Will they punish with more sanctions? Very unclear. So it's really a new moment in these the diplomatic negotiations.
Yeah, it sounds like someone has been boxed into a corner here. Very difficult to imagine what the Trump administration is going to do next. I mean, do you think Russia's position is, look, we've got the momentum on the battlefield at this particular moment after these long winters where not a lot happens on the battlefield because everyone's frozen into their positions. So why would we stop fighting now? Do you think that's where they're coming from?
Well, I think that's where they've always been. And that's what's been most perplexing about President Trump's view of Vladimir Putin's intentions, which is he seems to think that Putin does want a ceasefire, claims that was discussed on the phone. And the result is that the United States, we've given up much of our diplomatic leverage over Russia through rhetoric in particular related to, for example, the Secretary of Defense saying that the United States would not accept Ukraine into NATO. Of course, the dressing down of Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. And then after that, the withdrawal of American military and intelligence support, which led to a surge in Russian offensive activity. So it might very well be, and this is a lot of the discussion in Washington, that President Trump has rose-colored glasses on what he thinks Vladimir Putin's intentions are. Well, I think those glasses might now just be about ready to come off.
Yeah, I mean, very hard to predict, but I mean, what does President Trump do now? What would you advise him to do now? Should these talks even be taking place in Moscow, in your opinion?
Yeah, no, I would advise stay the course. Look, ultimately, it's crucial to have a diplomatic arrangement that ends this war. But be clear-eyed about what the real roadblocks are. The roadblocks are not all coming just from Ukraine, as you may have thought and even have been communicating. Russia started this war. Russia is the aggressor in this war. Russia has to be thought of as a belligerent, and that means think about actions that you can take to try to flip the narrative and put the pressure back on them now that Ukraine has taken your hints and agreed to what you're looking for in the near-term ceasefire. So stay the course and find a way to continue to balance the diplomacy and to get Russia and Vladimir Putin's attention, because clearly it doesn't seem like he has it yet. President Trump does not have it yet.
I mean, looking at this from the United States, I mean, we're on the outside, we're not there. Does it look to you like Ukraine is a little bit of a sideshow, and that the real crux of those talks and those delegations in Moscow is to mend fences with Moscow more broadly and re-establish diplomatic relations? And, well, if Ukraine doesn't work out, perhaps they'll just put it to one side and stop supporting Ukraine, if the bigger picture and the more important issue for the Trump administration is mending fences with Moscow?
It's a really valuable and important question. Those are the political cross-currents behind the policy, without a doubt. And there has been, for the past several years, broad bipartisan support for defending Ukraine. And that support continues, although amongst Republicans, it's much quieter now because President Trump has taken a very aggressive posture towards Ukraine on a diplomatic front. And so there's a bit of a wait-and-see approach amongst Republicans, but not amongst Democrats. And so this question about the big picture, the great game, the reshaping, realigning with Russia, that might be where President Trump wants to go, but he doesn't yet have the Republican Party on board with that. Certainly, Republicans in Congress do want to see an end to the war, are unhappy with the idea of more military aid to Ukraine without any end point in sight. But the idea of realigning with Russia, that might be something that the president's thinking about, but he has not yet made that pitch effectively to Republicans, let alone Democrats in Congress.
Do you think the timing is all sort of off kilter? Because what's been dictating the timing for these talks is that President Trump wants a deal as quickly as possible, and we're coming up to the 2-month mark that he's been in office. And in fact, shouldn't it be the case that the time for talks is when the time is right for talks, not just because we're hitting the sort of the 2-month, 3-month mark since the start of the Trump presidency?
Well, I'll give President Trump credit for trying to jumpstart diplomacy. Diplomacy will have highs and lows. There's always the potential for inertia as well, but there's no natural moment exactly when diplomatic talks must start and must end. The one mistake that he made clearly, but it was a political choice, is that he said he could end this war in one day with one phone call. He said that on the campaign trail. Well, that clearly was a fantasy, and it's showing it was not realistic. But outside of that, what he is now experiencing is what the Biden team experienced quite extensively on Israel and Hamas, for example. Long, difficult, drawn-out diplomacy. So the next key question is for President Trump and his team, what is the forum they want to use for diplomacy? Do they want to have Steve Witkoff shuttling about? Do they still want to have the meetings in Saudi Arabia? What do they do with the NATO allies? I think now is a chance for them to think a little bigger picture about their diplomatic approach. But it is an important point to mention that he did kickstart this, and that is good in terms of trying to find a diplomatic solution to this war.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Always appreciated. Joel Rubin, thank you very much indeed. Meanwhile, Moscow says it has retaken control of another key town in the Russian region of Kursk. While Russian forces claim they're recapturing more of the occupied territory from Ukrainian troops. And the latest town to be recaptured is home to a now idle metering station for Russian gas to Europe. While Russia says it's in the final stages of an operation to regain full control of the Kursk region. Well, President Putin says he wants total victory in Kursk ahead of talks with the United States. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Robert Fox, the defence editor for the London Evening Standard newspaper. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Mr. Fox. Russia is saying it doesn't want a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine. It wants a long-term solution. What's your reading of that?
Well, Russia is very heavily into the mind games now that they've had the offer, as it were, with Steve Witkoff, the special representative almost for everything. He was mostly in the Middle East, but he's been conducting a lot of the talks, and he has gone to meet with Putin's representatives. And it's very interesting. He seems to be developing a partnership with key figure in foreign affairs intelligence for the Security Council, that is the Supreme Council around Putin, with Yuri Ushakov. And Ushakov has just come out and was saying, no, we don't want a temporary ceasefire. It's just which will just allow Ukraine to regroup, to replenish, to restock its ammunition, and be a very successful operational pause, which is precisely what the Ukrainians accuse the Russians of doing. So, as I was saying, it's a mind game that's going on. And of course, they're playing public information propaganda big time. And the most astonishing thing was President Putin donning his fatigues, which he is not wont to do, and going down to the Kursk front to say that this pocket that since summer the Ukrainians have exploited very successfully, it must say, inside Western Russia, it's all over for the Ukrainians. And they're really making this a big propaganda ploy to make it clear to the discerning public they see. They're the waverers in Europe as much as the waverers in the United States. Really, it's all over for Ukraine. And that's why we're going to get anyway, and we're beginning to hear it, maximalist demands for any peace deal. I think they're going to struggle to get the 30-day cessation of hostilities agreed by Zelensky's team in Jeddah. But it's mind games. A lot of the fighting is going on, and the on-off support for Ukraine by Trump's regime, whether they're going to resume allowing access to American real-time battlefield intelligence, which is as valuable or more valuable than actually the ammunition and the arsenal replenishment, which has been pretty steady, and there's been a bit of a build-up up till now.
Yeah, I mean, lots is happening. As we said at the beginning, this US delegation is in Moscow. We've been getting various bits of information from the Kremlin throughout the day. They're now saying that telephone conversation between Presidents Trump and Putin probably won't happen today. I mean, just going back to what you were saying with regards to, Russia's desire not to go ahead with this 30-day temporary ceasefire. I mean, did you see that coming? Was this quite predictable, especially given the fact they've got the momentum on the battlefield?
Yeah, I think we've got to be careful about how we define that momentum. I'm not naysaying it, because there is a real difference. But it's a tremendous gamble for Russia, and it does look, I agree with you, that they want to go on. They want to go on with operations, which are not entirely and wholly successful, given the weight of advantage, both in numbers and materiel. They should be doing much better. And I think still why they're not doing so well must be a cause for concern, and we'll come to that in detail in a minute. The negotiations on Ukraine and the like, and on Chechnya before that, have never gone smoothly. You may remember that after Crimea, when we got into the latter stages of the year that Crimea was annexed, by that I mean 2014, we had the Minsk agreements, again an agreement for a ceasefire, and then it didn't quite go well. And then we had Minsk too, but the fighting still went on in the Donbass, and there was a pretty good local war, very nasty local war, and it didn't stop ever there. These things never go smoothly. I think we've got to say what's going on in the battlefield. Yes, Ukraine is struggling, and it's struggling on account of numbers. It's very difficult to recruit numbers. And of course, it's the infantry that is so friable, so expendable on both sides. And what Russia seems to be doing is not that its recovery is particularly rapid, but it's rapid. It has really changed in building up mass. You know, before it was a tactical battalion or tactical battle groups, TPGs, 120 of them going in around February the 22nd in 2022. Now they're managed to build them up into big brigades and divisions and begin to operate like that. But this is the bit of rather interesting detail I've come to, that we were supposed to tell with this momentum which you've described building up. They should have taken Pokrovsk, by my calculation, right in the middle of the central front. Pokrovsk, or Pokrovska, it's a hub. They should have taken it 4 months ago. And yet I was reading in the last 36 hours, successfully, Ukraine has managed to push back, not entirely from the perimeter of Pokrovska, but a significant amount. And it's by their tactical use of drones, which is highly sophisticated, highly devolved, highly innovative, which is working so well. And their spookiness, as it were, with radio wave jamming is such that they have managed to neutralize in great areas the real menace up to the autumn, which was these glide bombs, which, you know, were standoff traditional bombs, which the Russians had adjusted very well into standoff sort of cruise bombs. And they were causing devastation, particularly in metropolitan Ukraine, in the cities, hitting civilian targets. They seem to have worked out, for the time being, how to deal with that. So the advantage is not entirely with Russia. And I think that this is where there's got to be a big calculation somewhere in Putin and Gerasimov's thinking. They've got 630,000 about, it's thought, committed to the battle area, the theater of operations, including in depth, well back into Western Russia. They're recruiting about 440,000 in the general call-out each year. And the last one went pretty well. They got 10,000 more than they requested. But they can't go on doing this forever because, as we know, it's the economy is completely geared to the war. It's overstretched. And you've got a very poor demographic outlook. Like most of Europe, they're facing demographic autumning and wintering. And yes, we've found evidence of 60 and 70-year-olds being found on the battlefield, either taken prisoner or, unfortunately, amongst the dead.
Yeah, and just lastly, I mean, turning our attention back to where we head from here diplomatically, I mean, supposing the US delegation does leave Moscow empty-handed, with Russia not agreeing to this temporary ceasefire, which looks like it's going to be the case. What does the Trump administration do next?
I think the Trump administration, I think Trump himself, as a man of limited patience, as we know, will be pretty mad at that. He doesn't like being thwarted. He doesn't like being crossed. He doesn't like big egos challenging him. And we know he's got pretty annoyed with Benjamin Netanyahu currently because over the hostage release discussions in the Middle East, and hence Trump empowered his people to go and talk directly to Hamas in Qatar, which annoyed the Israelis. So you're seeing a thing that's similar here. Putin's got to be very careful, and I'm not sure he's got it in him. He mustn't gloat. he mustn't be smug. If he reflects anywhere in public that he thinks that really, you know, we're on a roll now, I've bested Trump, you know, I've weakened the West, that will annoy Trump. And I think Trump will come at him with everything. He is very likely, he has promised, to restore intelligence access for the Ukrainians and to contribute materiel. By the way, the withdrawing of intelligence for a crucial period, I think, had a very, very serious tactical effect on the battle in Kursk. But there is another thing. The main thing, his main weapon is actually oil and gas. If he doubles down, I'm talking about Donald Trump now, and he has hinted that he's minded to do this. If Putin say, I'm not going to play diplomatic ball, I'm just going to play diplomatic cat and mouse with you, then I think Trump could start doing serious things further about the sanctions regime on Russia, which we know does hurt. And of course, he will say that off the table at the moment, forgive my grammar, is another thing that Putin desperately wants. He wants to reconnect, reestablish good relations with America, because he is losing very seriously, psychologically, economically, in a very important contested ground, and that is Africa and the Middle East. We've got the Middle East, we know a lot about there, and they had a big setback when Assad was overthrown in Syria, and the bases, the Russian bases at Tartus, Banyas and Latakia were compromised. But it's Africa that must be worrying Putin, which has been an area of exploitation and exploration, and we know that Wagner Group and its successors have worked there. But he and the Americans, by closing down USAID, have given the ground to China. And that is why I think that Putin must start calculating. He mustn't sacrifice the long game just to show that he can beat his chest and said, I've bested the world, and I can have a jolly good parade on Victory Day at the end of the first week of May in Red Square. Because short-term triumphalism might well be very, very damaging, possibly even fatal for regime Putin in the long run.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, for your analysis. Robert Fox, defence editor at the Evening Standard. Thanks again. The US President Donald Trump gave the Prime Minister of Ireland, Micheál Martin, a warm welcome at the White House on Wednesday. But during their talks, President Trump accused the EU of trying to rip the United States off, and he accused Ireland of having the US pharmaceutical industry in its grip. Well, the United States is Ireland's single biggest export market for pharmaceutical drugs and ingredients, mostly manufactured by American companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. Well, during the meeting, Trump attempted to smooth tensions by honouring the significant contributions of Irish Americans to US history. Well, when asked if Ireland was taking advantage of the United States, President Trump said, quote, "Of course."
The EU was set up in order to take advantage of the United States.
Including Ireland? Is Ireland taking advantage of the US?
Of course they are. I can't, I have great respect for Ireland and what they did. And they should have done just what they did. But the United States shouldn't have let it happen. We had stupid leaders. We had leaders that didn't have a clue. Or let's say they weren't business people, but they didn't have a clue what was happening. And all of a sudden, Ireland has, our pharmaceutical companies and other, this beautiful island of 5 million people has got the entire U.S. pharmaceutical industry in its grasp. And you mentioned housing and you mentioned other things. I mean, I have property in Ireland, as you know, and I love it. It does great.
President Trump there hosting the Irish delegation at the White House. Well, President Trump appeared to have had a change of heart about his proposal to permanently expel residents of Gaza from that enclave. Last month, he sent shockwaves through the Middle East and beyond by saying that he proposed a US takeover of the Gaza Strip.
Nobody's expelling any Palestinians. I don't know. Who are you with?
I'm with Voice of America, sir.
Oh, no wonder. Okay, Voice of America.
Well, on a lighter note from President Trump, he interrupted a meeting with Ireland's Prime Minister Micheál Martin to compliment Vice President J.D. Vance on his shamrock-themed socks. Well, the shamrock, which is a type of clover, is a symbol that represents Ireland.
And by the way, I have to speak of inflation. I love these socks. What's with these socks?
It's in honor of the T-shirts.
I'm trying to stay focused, but I'm very impressed with the VP's socks.
Well, for more on that visit to Washington by the Irish Prime Minister, we can speak now to Tony Connelly, the Europe editor for RTE News, who joins us from Brussels. Tony, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was, of course, the first Oval Office meeting between President Trump and a foreign leader since that famous Zelensky shouting match. How did the Irish leader, Micheál Martin, get on in those talks, do you think?
Well, certainly his advisors were quite nervous about how this would go. And as you say, it was preying on everyone's mind that this was the first world leader to attend the Oval Office since President Zelensky. So there was a lot of nervousness about how things would go. This was a 50-minute conversation. It was more than a conversation. It was essentially a performance by Donald Trump with Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, trying to get a word in here and there in a way that would, I suppose, let him show that he was standing up for Ireland and Europe and himself, and not to be pushed around, but not offending his host. So this was a very, very delicate balancing act diplomatically, and in some ways the best diplomacy is to say nothing. And that was certainly the case with Micheál Martin. Donald Trump is holding court on a whole range of issues which are his pet subjects, about his perception that the EU is out to screw the United States. And he mentions Ireland in that context, although he did say that Ireland was very smart. Ireland is home to a huge array of US pharmaceutical companies, and he was kind of taking issue with that. Micheál Martin was trying to say it's a two-way street. There are tens of thousands of jobs in the United States provided by Irish companies. The airline Ryanair, for example, buys scores of Boeing jets. So he was trying to, in some ways, stand up for himself, stand up for Ireland, but also try to make it constructive and to keep it light. And I think overall, the critics would say that he pretty much pulled it off.
OK, so some polite pushback from the Irish Prime Minister there. And of course, as you've been saying, President Trump seems to really have it in for the European Union, saying it was created to rip off the United States. I'm just wondering how all of that goes down where you are in Brussels.
Well, in Brussels at the moment, we are somewhat transfixed by the trade war, the tariffs that Donald Trump imposed on the European Union, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium. They were announced on the 10th of February. They took effect yesterday. Europe immediately retaliated with 25% tariffs on a whole range of US goods, from bourbon whiskey to denim to Harley Davidson motorbikes, essentially restoring tariffs that were there from Donald Trump's first term. And the European Union will be coming back with more tariffs, countermeasures as they're called here, in due course, perhaps by the middle of April. I mean, the European Union is still really reeling from the stunning reversal of US policy by Donald Trump on a whole range of issues, most notably Russia and Ukraine. So, his pronouncements that Europe was designed to rip off America, as he would put it, are greeted with eye rolling here. People think it's completely ignorant, given that the European Union was created with American support as a peace project after the Second World War. So this is all part of a shocking realization by the European Union that they can no longer regard the United States as a trusted ally. And that's a huge thing for people to actually metabolize and to get their heads around.
One of the things they talked about, one of the several topics raised in the Oval Office, was the Middle East peace process. And clearly this is an issue very close to the hearts of Irish people. What is Ireland's official stance with regards to the Palestinians? And I'm just wondering, as an extension of that question, is Ireland's criticism of Israel the source of tension, do you think, between Dublin and Washington?
I think it is. I mean, if you ask Irish diplomats and politicians, they'll say that they're not pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, they're pro-international law. But they have rhetorically taken a much stronger line against Israel on its conduct of the Gaza war than many other European countries. And for its pains, they've seen the Israeli government withdraw its ambassador from Ireland and close its embassy in Dublin. And this, of course, is noted in the United States. The US, there are a lot of US companies that are located in Ireland, and I think there is definitely some unease in the US corporate sector, in the tech sector, about perceptions that Ireland is somehow anti-Semitic. Ireland has, in a sense, gone out on a limb with countries like Spain and to a lesser extent Belgium in really criticizing the Israeli conduct of the war in Gaza, its conduct in the West Bank and the occupied territories. There is actually a legislative bill going through the Irish Parliament, the Occupied Territories Bill, which would see a ban on any goods that are produced in illegal settlements in the West Bank and elsewhere. That's a very controversial piece of legislation, and the government is delicately trying to maneuver that legislation past the European Union and its laws, because the EU has sole competence for trade issues, and it has been noted in the corporate sector in America. So I think Micheál Martin was probably most anxious about how the Middle East question would go down in his conversation with Donald Trump yesterday. And his first answer on the subject was that he went to Israel a week after October 7th to express his solidarity with the Israeli people and government. And I think that went down well in the atmosphere in the room, the atmospherics. So again, I think he handled that quite well, but it was, possibly a very potentially difficult moment for the Taoiseach.
One of the surprising headlines to come out of that meeting, and it wasn't really directly, involving the Irish Prime Minister, was it sounded like President Trump, when asked, was backtracking on that idea of displacing Gaza's population to neighboring countries. I mean, is that something that stood out, and has that got lots of the media attention, would you say?
I mean, it didn't stand out that much, to be honest, in the Irish media. I mean, I think the Irish media was fixated on the question of whether or not Micheál Martin would simply get a mauling or be ridiculed, or that it would be just excruciating for him to try and handle the mood swings that can be associated with Donald Trump in that setting. I mean, I think the overall reporting on the meeting was that Micheál Martin had largely done well. He'd maybe come away with a few scratches and bruises, but he could say that it was, this was the most challenging diplomatic moment of his career. And he's had a very long career. He's a very experienced politician. So that particular aspect of it didn't dominate the headlines, certainly in Ireland.
Unlike Presidents Clinton, Kennedy, Biden, Obama, President Trump, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he's got any family ties to Ireland. And I'm just wondering whether in the past, having that connection between the president and the island of Ireland has been a contributing factor towards good, cordial relations.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been a hugely important part of Ireland's soft power, if you like. Ireland's a small country in the European Union. It's a neutral country. So much of its history is bound up with emigration to the United States in the 19th century and 20th century. And the bond between Ireland and successive presidential administrations in Washington is not to be taken lightly. Bill Clinton was a hugely important contributor to the Northern Ireland peace process. The whole Kennedy Camelot story in the 1960s, I think, really awakened our Irish people to the fact that there was this connection in the United States. Kennedy, of course, was probably the most famous Irish-American politician. So it's a very emotional relationship, and it's certainly one that Ireland has tried to capitalize on over the years.
Okay, and just lastly, the Vice President's socks seemed to generate quite a lot of discussion there, distracting the president. There were some laughs. Don't know what you thought of the socks, but would you say overall a good-natured meeting?
I think it was a good-natured meeting, and on the point of JD Vance, the fact that he'd met Micheál Martin before the Oval Office meeting and displayed his shamrock socks, I think certainly lightened the mood and probably gave Micheál Martin a bit of confidence going into the Oval Office.
Did you like the socks?
Loved them, yeah. Wouldn't buy them myself, but it was appropriate for St. Patrick's Day.
All right, thank you very much indeed for your time. Tony Connelly, Europe editor for RTE News. Thanks for your time. Well, that's all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.